Welcome back to Fear Files. Tonight, we bring together real-life haunting experiences reconstructed from first-hand testimony, accounts that begin in ordinary rooms and, at some small hour, remember to be unordinary. A brief warning, these stories include references to death and police investigations that some viewers may find disturbing. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hit the bell so you don't miss any of these reconstructions. Stay with us until the end. Each one closes differently, and some of the smallest details matter. Gabriel had taken the lease on the Victorian because it was cheap and quiet, and because silence, for him, had always been a resource. He was 28, finishing a thesis that required isolation rather than company, and the house, 3 stories with a sagging porch and a floorboard that always complained when he crossed it, felt like the right kind of solitude. The landlord called it character. Gabriel called it sufficiently affordable. At first, the house behaved like a house that had been left a long time. A perfume of old wood and mildew in a stairwell, the radiator clanking awake on cold mornings, dust that mapped the path of the previous owner's life in soft silhouettes. He worked at the kitchen table beneath a single lamp until the late hours, made the same instant coffee, and fell into the same dent on the sofa when the work finished. He kept a notebook, a playlist, and a practical skepticism about anything that smelled like superstition. The first sound arrived 2 nights after he moved in. It was a soft, measured knocking, 3 slow taps, coming from somewhere deeper in the house, like a voice beneath drywall. He sat up, listening. The clock over the stove read 3:03 a.m., the numbers smeared by the lamp's yellow. He told himself it was a neighbor, an old pipe settling, mice. He got up, crossed the floorboards that complained, and opened the basement door. The air inside was a darker, colder cadence of the house's smell, mildewed and sweet. He ran a hand along the concrete, called out an idle hello, and left the light on as he climbed back upstairs. Over the next week, the knocks returned with a precision that outlived coincidence. Always at 3. Always 3 soft taps. Sometimes the room's temperature would drop before he heard them. On one occasion, his breath fogged with a pale, unmoving cloud as if the house breathed colder than he did. The knocking never answered when he called, never repeated more than that discreet triple tap, and never came from a door or window he could pin down. It would start, then stop, and the house would settle into its benign old noises as if nothing at all had taken place. Gabriel told a friend in the department about it and got the laugh he expected. There are cheaper remedies than superstition, a friend said, like soundproofing and earplugs. But the pattern hardened his attention. He began leaving a small tape recorder on the kitchen counter before
bed just to give himself the comfort of an artifact, something he could later listen to and rationally dispatch. He woke to static and 3 faint clicks recorded at 3 a.m. and nothing else. He played it for sleep-deprived confirmation and felt the air in his apartments rearrange itself around the sound. One night, the knocking came with a new accent. After the taps, something else, like the scrape of a tin box against wood, followed. Gabriel crept toward the basement with a flashlight that trembled in his grip. The beam found nothing at first, just the stacked boxes of landlord debris, a bicycle, a single broken stool. The only new item was a small, shallow trapdoor under the back pantry shelf he'd never noticed. The house had kept a secret there, a seam in the floor, iron nails oxidized around its edge. He pried it open and smelled the faint, old sweetness of whatever had been kept wrapped in cloth for a long time. Inside the hollow was a metal box, the size of a shoebox, dulled with age. The lid fit snugly. When he lifted it, a sound came that was not of wood or metal, but of the breath he didn't know he was holding being let out. A pressure in the room that felt like the house inhaling with him. He opened the box. There was a photograph on top, its corners curled. A child, perhaps 3 or 4, smiling with a missing tooth where life had bitten later. There were 2 small shoes, scuffed and folded inward, as if no longer worn. Beneath them, a wrapped bundle. The coroner would later describe clinically in a report as human remains consistent with an infant. Gabriel could not explain the immediacy of the nausea that climbed his ribs. He set the box back, then pulled it forward again because the shape of deniability had broken and could not be mended by mere avoidance. He called the local police at 8 in the morning, voice steady with the practical cruelty of someone who has to explain the unbelievable. The officers who came were professional, methodical, 2 uniforms and a detective who asked direct questions without theatrics. They photographed the box, sealed the area, and took the items as evidence. The coroner's office collected the remains with the clinical language of a procedure. Remains recovered, post-mortem indicated, words that dampened the edge of horror into paperwork. The police asked about the previous owner, about neighbors, about any sign of a child. The landlord gave a name and a phone number, and a trail that stopped cold at an unlisted address. The discovery rippled outward. A detective came to speak to Gabriel in his kitchen while the tape recorder sat inert on the counter, like an embarrassed witness. They spoke of missing person reports from years back, of a case that had gone cold when leads dried up. The detective did not promise answers. He promised work. He asked Gabriel to email the photographs he had taken of the box's interior, to preserve the tape recorder, to note every sound. Gabriel, who had come to the house for silence, felt now he had been positioned at the hinge of noise, someone who would have to keep listening for the thing that would finish saying what it wanted. At night, the knocking stopped. For 2 weeks there were only the ordinary sounds: radiator, traffic when a truck passed on the adjacent street, the floorboard that had always complained. Gabriel slept as if he had been given another role, one that required vigilance only at the edges. He found himself, however, waking at 3 by sheer muscle habit. The clock would read 3, and the house would hold its breath. Sometimes, in that thin hour, he thought he heard the soft shuffle of a shoe inside the walls. He would sit up and tell himself to be rational. On the 3rd week after the discovery, a package arrived in the mail for Gabriel. The return address was empty, a clean white envelope with his name typed and no stamp, no postmark. Inside there was one folded page, a child's crayon drawing of a house with 4 windows and a single stick figure standing outside. On the bottom margin, someone had written in a small, careful hand, "He liked sugar on his bread." He showed the drawing to the detective. It matched a scrap found in the box, the same color, same wavering pressure of crayon. The forensic team arranged comparisons, handwriting analysis, and old schoolbook photos from the one archived police report the detective had been able to pull. Each small detail fit like a seam being stitched after years of frayed ends. A name surfaced, an old arrest record, a neighbor who remembered someone who had been seen leaving with small packages at odd hours. The case opened. In the quiet that followed the reopening of the investigation, Gabriel sometimes felt a presence near the stove, a tilt in the lighting that suggested someone had passed by but left no shadow. Once he found a child-sized shoe by the back door, positioned as if someone had slipped it off and left it there on purpose. He took it to the police. They took photographs. When the suspect was finally located, an older woman who had lived in the small house 2 streets over and who had been reported decades ago for strange nocturnal habits, the arrest was as prosaic and as human as every other arrest in the detective's career. A knock at the door, a request to step outside, an officer reading rights. The magnitude of the small death and the weight of the unearthed secret were transformed into procedural boxes, evidence logged, charges considered, investigations continuing. The coroner's office arranged for a proper burial. The community that had banded online around the case, led by neighbors who wanted to remember with dignity, contributed flowers and a small wooden marker where the remains were laid to rest.
A local cemetery. Gabriel attended, standing at the edge of a quiet group, his scarf tight against his neck, feeling the way people muttered prayers or silence in equal measure. The knocks never returned after the burial. At the house, the 3 o'clock habit of the clock seemed to lose its anthropomorphic insistence. The floorboard did not complain with the same sharpness when he crossed it. Sometimes, late at night, Gabriel would find himself turning on the lamp in the kitchen and staring at the space where the trapdoor had been. He kept the tape recorder in a drawer and, on some nights, took it out to play the static back. In the background of the recording, behind the crackle, he thought he could hear a sound he had learned to recognize not as menace, but as something like relief. The soft, almost inaudible exhale of a house finally letting go of its secret. Riley's story began with the kind of intimacy traffic that comes through a smartphone. A number she didn't know. A voicemail at 2:13 a.m. telling her she was being watched. She was 24 and booked into a small advertising firm by day, and by night she returned to an apartment 2 flights up, with a landlord who liked to charge late fees and a neighbor who kept to himself. She had, in the months before the calls, dismissed oddities as the modern erosion of privacy. Strangers knowing too much about what you liked online, an ad that felt too tailored. But the call was not a commercial algorithm. It was a voice both lonely and present, naming things nobody else would say. The color of her mug, what she had eaten for dinner, the way she left the lamp on for half an hour before sleep. The first few messages were menacing in a soft, casual way. The caller left fragments. "I like the way you talk when you don't know someone's listening. I saw you with your hair up. I watched the light through your blinds." Riley changed numbers, changed her voicemail settings, and took the sensible steps, documented each call, blocked numbers, screenshot everything. The caller adapted. He began to learn times, calls at 1:58 a.m., 2:02. He began to escalate beyond voice, items left on the stoop, her name scrawled in chalk by the lobby that washed away with the next rain. Her friends urged her to get a restraining order. The local police took the initial reports with practiced patience. Fill out the forms, keep records, reach out if something happens. The detective assigned to the case told her plainly that stalking cases are often a pattern. They wanted to build one that would hold in court. Riley did the work. She logged the calls, she saved the voicemails, she installed motion-activated lights outside her door, and an app that would contact the police at her tap. On a night when the city felt like a bowl of air, hot, thin, bearing the faraway hum of traffic, the calls took on a new dimension. At 2 a.m., the lights in her apartment flickered. Her phone buzzed with a text that said only 3 dots, as if the sender was typing and refused to finish. Then there was a soft knock at her door. 3 measured taps. It was not the rhythm of the neighbor's loose riser. It was deliberate. She did not answer. She set the chain and peered through the peephole. On the stair landing stood a figure, small enough to be a man, but indistinct in the security camera's grain. Riley called the non-emergency police number and told them someone was outside. The dispatcher's voice was busy and calm. "If you're in danger, call 911, she said. The patrol car arrived 12 minutes later, calmer than the calendar in a heartbeat. But when an officer walked the stairs, the figure was gone. What followed was a stretch of procedure and practical protection. The officers increased patrols for the building when she called. The detective arranged for a temporary move to a friend's place while they sought a search warrant, and the local community group set up a watch. They traced the phone signals, worked with telecoms to pull metadata, and interviewed the neighbor who lived by the stairwell. For weeks, the violence existed mostly in the vellum of documentation. Timestamps, IP addresses, a map of the patterns by which the caller's presence moved like a tide. Then a breakthrough came in the form of a camera. An old security camera at the corner store down the block had recorded a man loitering at 1:45 a.m. looking up at Riley's building as if studying a painting. The detective pulled a frame of the man's face and sent it to Riley, who recognized a regular from the lobby, a tenant who had once offered to fix her mail slot. When officers paid him a visit, they found more than familiarity. There were notes in his apartment with Riley's name and address, and a small cache of her cast-off clothing in a bald heap. He denied wrongdoing at first, and then, when confronted with the evidence, admitted he had been following her, convinced he could be close to someone who had not asked for him. The arrest was not cinematic. It was a quiet evening knock, an iron hand on the shoulder, and a reading of rights. The charges filed were stalking and unlawful surveillance. The legal process that followed was not a cure for the fear she had lived under,
But it was containment. At a hearing, the judge ordered the man to stay away, to surrender his devices as evidence, to submit to monitoring when necessary. The detective told Riley that prosecutions in these cases were never guaranteed, but evidence and persistence mattered. Riley made deliberate choices afterward. She moved to a ground-floor unit in another part of town where the landlord agreed to change the locks on the first day she moved in. She began taking evening walks with friends
and posted her itinerary to a group chat. She learned to quantify safety not as a feeling, but as a set of actions. Change numbers, document, call. The knocks at 2 stopped. On a windy night months later, she stood at a small memorial vigil at the community center for people harmed by stalking and harassment. She held a candle and listened to others speak of the slow, steady work of regaining a life that fear had interrupted. There was closure of a procedural kind, a suspect arrested, devices logged as evidence, and a restraining order that the court reinforced. There was also a quieter, personal restoration, the small acts of regaining routine that stitched back an ordinary life. By the time the case was in the hands of prosecutors, Riley had learned the vocabulary of protection and the practical choreography of safety. She kept a small list on her phone, names of trusted neighbors, the detective's direct line, a set of passwords she rotated with alarming frequency. She slept differently. Sleep, she would come to say, had a new, deliberate architecture. Caleb was a landlord's problem before he became anything else. He worked nights at the hardware store and rented out 2 rooms in a converted row house whose attic space had been turned into a small studio he charged extra for. He was practical to the point of bluntness: fix the problem, collect the rent. And the house's previous tenants filtered through in the shape of a mailbox full of canceled checks. The studio tenant who moved in last spring was a school teacher named Mara who liked the top-floor light and kept a potted fern on the sill. One rain-heavy morning, Caleb received a call from a neighbor who spoke with a kind of tired urgency. There was a smell under the back porch. When Caleb went to investigate, he felt the air slick with a dampness that did not belong to weather alone. He traced the scent to a soft hollow beneath the back landing where the foundation had settled. He pried up a loose board and found, wrapped in an oilcloth and tucked behind an old brick, a small bundle that contained a child's doll and, beneath the cloth, the kind of skeletal remains a coroner later described without melodrama as partial remains consistent with a juvenile. Caleb, steady as he was, felt the room tilt. He closed his eyes and called the police. The local detectives moved with a practiced economy: tapes, gloves, photographs. They asked Caleb about who else had access to the property, what neighbors were called, and whether any tenants had complained of unusual noises. Mara came out to the back alley and stood with her arms around herself. She had slept through the rain the night before and had only noticed the next morning when she came outside for coffee. She had, she said, a memory of a child's laughter in the house years ago, an old family who had once occupied the building, but nothing precise. The building's history was a patchwork of stories: a grieving mother years prior, a succession of tenants no one thought to keep track of. The case would, the detective warned, be a tricky weave from such fragments. Caleb, who had built a life on the assumption that hands repair could straighten any bent thing, found himself caught in a task beyond carpentry. He had to decide what to do with the house's memory. He organized a meeting with the tenants and suggested they hold a small, respectful burial for the remains once the coroner and police allowed release to a community service for proper interment. The tenants, neighbors, and an outreach group that worked with forgotten histories agreed. Without drawing a spiritual boundary that claimed absolution, they collected flowers, a small wooden box, and a set of names, most of them unknown or infant, that would be read aloud in the cemetery's quiet. Before the burial day, however, Caleb and Mara found a journal under a loose stair tread. It had been written in the cramped hand of someone who tracked days by small domestic details: bread burned on a Sunday, the temperature of the porch rail, a neighbor lending a cup of flour. The journal mentioned names, a child's nickname, a fear that someone would come for what had been hidden. It did not resolve the story, it only made the human edges visible.
They read the pages together in the back kitchen, the rain having stopped and the house smelling oddly of lemon cleaner and old paper. Between them, as the words rearranged into a narrative of everyday life and quiet desperation, the mystery felt less like an abstract crime and more like a loss with a long tail. The police worked the angles. Missing person reports, archived calls, a neighbor who, in his older memory, recalled a woman who had lived there and gone away without saying anything. There was a person of interest identified through a combination of witness interviews and a name that surfaced in the old rent ledger. He had a history of domestic instability and an arrest record that included charges unrelated to this case. The detective sought a warrant, the district attorney reviewed the evidence, and charges were eventually filed. What mattered most in the end to those who had gathered at the burial was not the technical language of prosecution, but the human act of acknowledgement. They set the small wooden box into the ground, and someone read aloud the sparse words from the recovered journal. And instead of a stranger's remains, they set down a person who had been part of a house's life. Caleb stood with his hands in his pockets and felt, for a moment, the weight of the house leaving his shoulders. He had been the one to pry up the board, to take the call, to make the arrangements. The neighbors who had once whispered about strange smells and odd hours now spoke in softer, public voices about how they might look out for each other. Later, when the legal process had carried the story from the coroner's report to arraignment, the detective told Caleb in a concise way what those proceedings meant. There would be a trial, perhaps plea negotiations, the possibility of a conviction, and Caleb listened with the kind of attention he gave to tools. He did not expect the legal system to repair a life, but he recognized its capacity to hold someone accountable, to mark an official boundary. The house, after the burial, felt different. The boards do not close themselves, but sometimes a place needs someone to name what happened within it. Night after night, the small motifs threaded through each of these moments. A clock striking 3, the breath of cold air that made skin feel like a windshield in winter, an object that tethered a presence to a place. These were not theatrical devices, they were the small repeated evidence that witnesses brought forward, the times, the knocks, the photographs. Each story moved from an ordinary beginning through increasing specificity toward a confrontation that was either human or material, and then toward a resolution that, whether legal or ritual, attempted to make right what had been left wrong. Outside the houses, the detectives and the community groups began to share notes informally. What times reappeared in recordings? What kinds of objects turned out to be anchors? How a simple ritual could sometimes provide more immediate relief than any legal filing. For Gabriel, it was a burial that quieted the night. For Riley, it was legal containment and community vigilance. For Caleb, it was the decision to name and to enter. There are more stories that move in that same range, some resolved with police work, some with quiet human acknowledgments, some that close with an acceptance that not everything will be understood, and that too, can be a kind of end. Each account rests on small artifacts, a photograph, a shoe, a journal, objects that make the intangible touchable. And in rooms where silence once ruled, the practice of listening, careful, attested, documented, proved its own protection. The house on Gabriel Street kept its shape, and Gabriel kept his lamp on long after the burial. Riley learned to sleep again in a way that did not require a phone at arm's length. Caleb learned that vigilance and empathy could be part of the work of keeping a building safe. The motifs lingered in each life. 3, the triple tap, the cold breath, the box. They were not always malevolent. Sometimes they were the last expression of a story seeking acknowledgement. There are moments in all of these accounts where the dread condenses into a single image. A hand on a window in the rain, the static on a voicemail, the photograph that will not lay flat. Those images are not spectacle. They are the persistence of memory refusing to dissolve into anonymity. In each case, a human response arrived, a detective's patience, a neighbor's willingness to speak up, a community's choice. To bury rather than ignore. Closure arrived as both procedure and small ritual. It did not always bring comfort. Often it brought something quieter, a boundary, an acknowledgement, a way to close a door. We'll continue with more reconstructed accounts, stories of hospital night shifters who hear confessions through staticky intercoms, of a caretaker who keeps playing games to keep a child's shadow company, of an heir who finds a trunk with a map that refuses to be misread. Each one follows the same slow architecture: normalcy, the first anomaly, the patterning of events at a precise hour, an investigation, and then a resolution that returns, somehow, to human hands. In the ward, the intercom hummed like a refrigerator, always present, always low, and at certain hours its ordinary hum thinned into something else. Mara, who worked night shifts for 7 years, learned the hospital's geography by sound: the distant clatter of a trolley, the soft practiced argument of 2 nurses comparing charts, the tired automatic beeping from a monitor that never entirely slept. One winter, in a week when the weather sent the city's breath cold and flat, the intercom began to cut between fragments of speech and a wide-band static that seemed to hold voices like seeds. The first time she heard it, she thought it was someone's radio left on. A patient on 3 East, delirious and talking about coming home, had always been the ward's loose thread. Staff had grown used to tying him back into the present. But the voice that came through the intercom was not his cadence. It was nearer the thin, deliberate tone of confession. Short sentences, names offered like small weights. "Tell them," it said, and then the squeal of white noise. Mara rewound the overnight tape and listened, and there it was again. An inflection that could have been a human throat, carried through the speaker as if the walls themselves were translating memory into sound. She kept a journal on a clipboard in her locker, the same kind of ledger nurses used to note minor medical changes. In the margin she wrote times: 03, 03, 03. She began to chart the events that followed with the same trained, dispassionate hand she used for vitals. A patient 2 rooms over, a woman who slept in fits and started humming to herself, became less restless after the intercom voice softened and a nurse tucked a blanket over her shoulders. Another night, a cleaning woman found, tucked beneath an old armchair, a photograph folded into a paper bag, the face of a boy no one recognized. The photo smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. When the photograph was placed on the windowsill facing the ward, the short, sharp confessions turned to long, indifferent static and then ceased entirely. A small ritual developed among the night staff. They began to leave a lamp lit in the corridor outside the ward, not for safety, but as a witness. They set out a tin of tea, allowed a small radio to hum. Human sounds in the empty staff room. On Sundays, on their day off, 2 of the nurses brought in a box of children's books and left one on each windowsill. "For any voice that might come in," Mara said once, and they laughed under their breath as if laughter were itself an offering. The hospital's director, practical and unwilling to indulge superstition, nevertheless approved an internal review after complaints from patient families. The review's conclusion was predictably bland: electrical interference, a legacy speaker system, the suggestibility of exhausted minds. But the nurses had already moved past institutional explanations. For them, the work was not to prove the sound, but to respond. They listened, rearranged, set small objects where the sound seemed strongest. Whatever else those nights produced, sleep, a paused grief, was secondary to the steadiness of human attention. On the far side of town, in a house whose wallpaper had forgotten its original pattern, Tomas spent his days and most of his nights with a child named Eli. The story that had placed them together was practical and complicated: a temporary guardianship, an ex-wife reaching for a new job in another city, a foster system with more forms than faces. Tomas, who had been a caretaker for 20 years, arrived with the quiet of someone who had learned to build continuity out of interruptions. He owned a small radio, 3 board games, and a pocketful of coins for a vending machine he hardly used. He believed, stubbornly and simply, that children could be met on the ground of play. Eli's shadow began to shift at precisely the hour when the house cooled, the hollow between dusk and an actual night. It pooled against the foot of the bed, and sometimes, Tomas swore, the head of the bed breathed outward. The shadow was a shape that arrived without explanation, a slip of a silhouette, small and eager, as though a child who could not be seen was leaning in to listen. To keep the shadow company, Tomas introduced rules of play. At 7:15 every evening, they would spread a blanket on the floor and set out a single game. Tomas insisted on rituals. The way dice were rolled under a careful hand, the deliberate placing of a card, the counting of points allowed. He called the routine the sitting. He would narrate everything. Now we move the knight, now the tower falls, so that an invisible partner might understand the rules of a world that had once excluded them. Neighbors at first thought Tomas eccentric. They watched him through kitchen windows and whispered about how he talked to the empty chair. Then they began to donate small things: a wooden train, a plush rabbit with one ear stitched, a stack of picture books with frayed corners. The objects mattered. The rabbit smelled like cedar. The train wheel had a nick that matched a dent in the floor Tomas himself now avoided. A small box of matches, left on a shelf by one of the neighbors, became a talisman. Tomas kept them in his pocket, and before each game he would tap the matchbox thrice, a triple tap that someone once taught him when his own child was small. He had no belief in warding as such. He believed in protocol, predictable acts that made life less likely to fracture. It worked in ways no chart could track. On a morning when the house was visited by social workers and forms and the thin, terrible language of assessment, Eli brought his trainer into the evaluation room and placed it on the table, as if the toy could vouch for a life. The social worker, who had seen countless piles of evidence and calls of alarm, softened at the sight. She asked Tomas, politely and then more honestly, what he did in the nights when the house was quiet. "I play," he said. "I keep the light. I count the cards." She took notes, but what she recorded later, beyond procedure, was the way Eli touched the rabbit and hummed, and the triple tap the matchbox made when Tomas set it down. Sometimes the ritual is less about proof and more about permission. Permission for a shadow to be attended to, permission for a person to keep living among things that move uncertainly. Then there was Lucia, the heir, who discovered in an attic chest a map that refused to be misread. She had come to the house because of paperwork and not nostalgia. The place had once belonged to an uncle she had remembered only in fragments, a man who kept his mail in labeled envelopes and who kept better company with clocks than with people. The trunk she pried open had the smell of old wood and something else like dried ink. Under layers of handbills and a folded winter scarf, she found a map drawn in a careful, impatient hand. The map was wrong in the ways that mattered. The river ran a hair's breadth from its real course. A bend in the road continued through a fence and into a neighbor's yard. A church bell was labeled twice. She took the map to town with the intention of folding it again and putting it where no one would ask questions. But maps are not inert when carried. They will press into pockets and remind holders of seams. At 3 p.m, under a street lamp that still smelled faintly of diesel, she noticed something written in a margin, in a script that matched no one she knew. For the one who would return what was left. That line was a hinge. She began to follow the map's errors as if they were instructions. Turning where the pavement suggested one should not, slipping through a gate that was labeled private, and finding, in a neglected lot, a mound of earth marked by a small stone. The stone covered something that had been left intentionally easy to miss. A tin box, rusted at the seam, tied with a shoelace that had frayed into softness. Inside the box was a photograph, creased and annotated on the back with a single date, and a child's boot, the type no longer sold, the leather cracked as if it had lived many small collapses. Lucia sat on the curb, the shoe in her lap, and understood that some things are not lost so much as misplaced in the architecture of human oversight. She did what Gabriel had done with his lamp. She named the object and gave it a place. She organized a small burial, respectful and without ceremony, at the edge of the lot where the city kept reluctant trees. A neighbor brought soil. Someone from the church covered the ground with a soft, ordinary prayer. The act did not explain the map, nor did it promise comprehension. It changed instead the posture of the neighborhood toward the lot, from neglect to attention. These accounts traveled between people like a domestic rumor. They were not sensational so much as instructive. Detectives kept their files. Social workers filled out the forms that made claims legible to the state. But the real work of closure frequently occurred in actions that had nothing to do with paperwork. a lamp placed in a hallway, a photograph set on a sill, a rabbit held tightly while a child slept. Those acts required only a witness and a hand steady enough to do small, ordinary things again and again. Across the city, patterns began to look less like coincidence and more like an emergent grammar. The time, 3 a.m., or the fractal of 3 itself, reappeared often enough that people mentioned it in passing, as one mentions a weather pattern. The triple tap showed up in different forms: knock, knock, knock on a back door, a matchbox tapped thrice on a table, a soft rapping at the glass that woke the person inside just before dawn. Cold breath was a phrase used by someone who opened a window and felt winter lean in. Boxes, tin boxes, shoe boxes, matchboxes, appeared as repositories, small temples in which attention could be placed and then moved. Those who studied patterning, the detectives and the community organizers, began to catalog not only the anomalies, but the human mechanisms that responded to them. Listening proved itself to be a technology as effective as any recorder. A neighbor's willingness to look into an empty lot could be more urgent and immediate than a 911 call. A burial could arrive sooner than a trial. People were not saying that ritual always fixed things. They were saying instead that ritual often changed the shape of grief and made possible a trajectory away from fear. There were, of course, moments when a ritual could not reach across the private architecture of harm. Legal proceedings moved with their own rhythm. A trial could vindicate or leave new wounds. Some nights the intercom hummed again, and the staff's lamp did not alter the sound. Tomas sometimes found Eli awake in the dark, and despite the games and the patterns, the shadow returned. Lucia could bury the tin and still carry the photograph in her wallet for months. Yet the cumulative effect of these small, intentional acts was not negligible. They altered routines, they taught neighbors the grammar of attention, and they provided evidence that the world could be altered by repetition and witness. In an old precinct office, a young detective wrote a note that read like a manual of cautious hope. He listed anchors, photographs, shoes, maps, times. He listed responses: burial, lamp, playing, listening. At the bottom of the page, he drew a small cruciform, not as an emblem of faith, but as a practical mark to separate one cluster of observations from another. He pinned the paper to a board where other papers hung: missing persons flyers, a faded postcard, a photograph of a house with a board lifted at one corner. The board itself became a map of attention. What persisted across these accounts was less the insistence on a single truth than the insistence on a practice. The city discovered, in the quiet work of people caring for the things that tethered memory to place, a method of restitution that existed outside courts and case numbers. Someone would notice a time repeating in a voicemail, and another would bring a lamp. Someone would play a game at night, and someone else would bury a photograph properly. The work was incremental, human-sized, often anonymous, and it made a difference. There are more rooms still to be visited. There are hospital corridors that keep a different set of sounds, attics with other maps that will not be misread, caretakers who will play out yet more rules. The city, in its small ways, keeps learning the grammar. The next set of accounts will look, at first, like ordinary cases. An embalmer who keeps a watch, a librarian who tapes a torn page with notes in the margin, an old woman who pins a scarf to a fence and refuses to remove it. Each story will follow the same architecture: a beginning in normalcy, a first anomaly, a pattern, an investigation, and then a human resolution that returns, finally, to hands and names and something placed where it can be seen. In every instance, the idea of listening, careful, attested, documented, keeps proving itself as a means of protection that is as practical as any law. The embalmer was a man who moved as if his hands remembered a language older than speech. He worked at night when families could arrive without the glare of daylight showing the edges of their grief. His parlor smelled of cedar, formaldehyde, lemon oil. There were soft rugs to catch footsteps and a metal tray that held rows of tools, each polished and set as if to be touched in sequence. He called himself careful, which meant he kept a ledger and labeled everything: name, date of reception, the time he set the watch. He knew from years of quiet service how rituals could ease the shape of a farewell, how a straightened collar or a coin placed beneath a hand could answer an ache in a way a verdict could not. The anomaly began with a watch. Not a wristwatch, but the old clock that hung near the back door, a brass thing that had belonged to the parlor since before he did. One morning he found it stopped at 3. Not 3:15 or 2:59, 3, exact as if some unseen finger had pressed pause. He wound it. The next night it stopped again, and the night after that. He set another clock on the mantel. It too stalled at 3. Then a neighbor's son who delivered flowers at dawn told him about the knock, 3 light thunders at a back gate, before the day had learned to be bright. The embalmer began to notice other things out of place. A matchbox set beside a tray, its lid tapped thrice. A tin with a photograph tucked under the lining. A shoebox full of letters he had never been asked to open. He began, without telling anyone, to keep watch. For 3 nights he stayed at the parlor after his work and sat with the caskets, not in a sensibility of mourning, but as witness. He opened drawers, and, when he found a photograph turned over, he would lift it, breathe across the glossy face, and set it upright on a small easel. If a letter lay folded with a corner creased, he smoothed it and placed it in a labeled envelope. He learned to fold hands in a way that felt like a promise. On the 4th night, a neighbor woke to find the parlor's back window fogged from breath, though no heat had been left on. When she knocked the 3 knocks, the embalmer answered and held the door open to the dawn. The small acts multiplied. A lamp placed beside the couch in the parlor, a candle lit in the vestibule, a shoebox sealed with tape and buried temporarily beneath a potted fern in the small courtyard. The watch did not unwrite sorrow, but families later said it had made their goodbyes feel true. At the library, the anomaly asserted itself through ink. A book returned from the stacks bore, folded into its spine, a page torn and taped with unsteady fingers. On the margin were words, names, a time, 3 a.m., and a circle drawn with a hand that trembled. The librarian, a woman with spectacles that sat low on her nose, kept the book at the desk for a day and then refused to shelve it. She made a copy of the torn page and placed both, with a strip of archival tape, into a file labeled Notations. She began to listen in a different way, to the way patrons paused at the history shelves, the way one old man always preferred a certain chair near the reading lamp, the way a youngster hummed a tune that matched, in rhythm, 3 careful beats. When the pattern returned, someone returned a book with a matchbox tapped thrice inside it. The librarian did not laugh it off as superstition. She taped the torn page again, but this time she did so reverently. For a week she taped and relisted and then taped once more. Each time she would thump the tape with 3 small strikes before smoothing it down, as if to count a blessing. She posted a sticky note on the staff board: "If you find names in margins, do not ignore." A volunteer found, in the folios of a 19th century ledger, a tiny rectangular of cloth, a scarf thread, pinned to the leaf as if someone had marked a memory. The librarian wrote the name beside it and pinned the leaf to the board in the back, and, slowly, a small congregation of papers gathered: marginalia, matchboxes, lists. The old woman who pinning scarves was a fixture at the corner where the avenue lost itself into a fence of chain link. She had a slow gait, and her hair was white as the pages the librarian mended. For years she brought scarves to the fence, bright ones, faded ones, a child's rag with a cartoon dog, and tied them there in knots that never loosened. People called her eccentric. Mothers told their children not to tangle themselves in the scarves, and teenagers took pictures of the fluttering fabric and called it an installation. When the pattern began to press itself into the corners of life, the scarves took on a different name: markers. One winter she arrived each morning before dawn and, with gloved fingers, pinned a scarf to the link at precisely 3 a.m.
If someone asked why, she would only say, "so that someone knows where to look." She refused to cut the knot. Once, a city worker removed a scarf in the course of routine maintenance. The old woman's neighbors found her in the porch, hooded and white-faced, and they returned the scarf at noon, leaving it on the fence and watching until she took it in her hands again and pressed it to her cheek. People began to bring scarves to her door, donations perhaps, or offerings, and she kept them in a trunk beneath her bed, a bright heap of attention. The detectives folded these accounts into the board with the cruciform. At first, the connections were simply lines on paper: photo here, scarf there, clock stopped at 3. But as more reports came in, the lines became a map not only of objects, but of gestures. In one cluster of neighborhoods, matchboxes and scarves aligned like constellations. In another, the triple tap echoed against hospital corridors where attendants found a small shoe placed on a windowsill, a lamp left burning in a visitor's chair, a photograph taped to a sterile cabinet. What changed was not the presence of harm. The world still held the same number of injustices, but the shape of attention. Where once a missing person might have been reduced to a docket number, they now had a place. People put names on the things they left behind, and left those things where they could be seen. Relatives began to call one another with instructions like recipes: fold the photograph twice, bury the tin near the oak, place a lamp that faces the door. The rituals did not guarantee recovery. Sometimes a body was never found, a trial yielded no answer. But there were nights when a neighbor's vigilance found a clue sooner than an official would have, when a needle of detail retrieved a narrative that would otherwise have been lost. In one case, a small, private account that the board swallowed with others, a shoemaker noticed a pair of child-sized shoes on his stoop at 3 a.m., neat and dustless as if set down by polite hands. He catalogued their size, wrapped them in paper, and placed them beneath his stool. The next morning, a woman he did not know came asking after that size. They spoke over tea in his dim shop, and the woman said a name he had seen in a missing persons flyer. She knelt and took the shoes, and for the first time in months she could point to something and say, "Here is where I begin again." The shoemaker later told the detective that he had only done what his mother had told him: keep the things you find, because things remember. Hands collected names. Names anchored rituals. Rituals drew strangers into the tidy geometry of bearing witness. The precinct board filled with color, with folded photographs and taped pages, and a pair of tiny shoes that hung from a thumbtack. Whoever visited it could see at a glance how ordinary acts, tapping, burying, pinning, placing, had become a vernacular of care. The city had not declared a new law or budgeted for the practice. It had learned to meet the gap left by systems that move slowly with a human speed that was neither hurried nor indifferent. Yet, even in the midst of this steady work, there were nights that revealed the limits of ritual. A nurse in an emergency ward hummed to a child and left a lamp lit on the bedside table, and still the child's family left with questions that had no simple remedy. A librarian taped a torn page and later learned that the notes on its margin had been written by someone long gone. The embalmer buried a photograph and then spent weeks waking with a sense of absence no solace could fully answer. The rituals altered the shape of sorrow but could not dissolve it. And so the grammar continued to extend, reaching into attics and corridors and shops. New practices would arrive. An evening when a neighbor read aloud the name written in a margin. A night when a group of volunteers walked the blocks and left small labeled piles of stones where someone remembered walking with a loved one. The board at the precinct would hold these new entries, and the cruciform would multiply into a faith of sorts that repeated, attentive acts could hold open a space in which the living might find each other again. In the quiet hours, when the lamps burned low and the city answered its own echo, the pattern no longer looked like a list of anomalies. It looked like a method, a grammar for a city trying, with imperfect hands, to keep its losses legible. There would be more rooms to enter, more hands to learn the rules. The next accounts would come from places not yet spoken for,
An attendant in a hospice, a janitor in a school, a young father who learned to listen when his son tapped the table 3 times before sleep. Each would add a small instrument to the communal toolbox of attention, and each, in its own way, would return the work, at last, to hands and names and something left where it could be seen.